Hello there. A little while back in one of many of my poetry videos, I said I would explain where some of the poems came from in each of my poetry books, Youth and Screaming Sweet Nothings. Youth was the first book I published in 2017. I was about 18 or 19 at the time. This book talks about what it's like to be young, aside from working and school. All the moments of loneliness and broken friendships and long-distance relationships, your first times, both the worst and the best. Whereas Screaming Sweet Nothings was published a couple years later when I was about 21. It's a collection of some really terrible events I went through between the 2 years of publication. I talk about an emotionally and physically abusive relationship, along with sexual harassment at work, sexual harassment in general, traumas coming up, and suicidal thoughts. They both have quite different tones to them. Youth is quite descriptive and imaginative, whereas Screaming Sweet Nothings is quite emotional and to the point. So with that said, I'm going to pick roughly 10 poems from each book and explain what happened in my life that led to its creation. I'm webcam quality. Dirt poor, pouting for your late night video calls and pills that poke the insides of my cheeks. Tongue teased from your cyber kink. I let you use me, because it's almost like feeling needed. I met this guy online when I was 18 and he was 24, so not a good situation. At that time, I hadn't dealt with the traumas in my life and had a very toxic household, so my mental health was low. But he kind of took me out of that time when we first met online and ended up getting into a rather toxic situation. We were in that zone of more than friends but not quite dating. Amongst it all, I fell in love, and he knew it and took that opportunity to manipulate me. I used the word cyber kink in this poem to kind of describe that. He liked where we were at and how he treated me, no matter how sad it made me. You've been the only one to understand that suffering is what breathing feels like. Involuntary and necessary, and yet all we do is hurt each other. This is about the same person. He was the first person to understand my depths, the sort of abuse I'd been through and the severity of my depression, and I was that person to him as well. We connected over tragedies, and through my attachment issues and his fear of loneliness, kept each other alive, maybe not fulfilled, but alive. But it was all through a place of emotional immaturity. No matter how we loved each other, neither of us felt good enough for the other person, and we were constantly self-sabotaging. The intersecting crosswalk stopped with us on a central boulevard. City sounds clutched to our skin, tighter than our clothes sweat with emptied hearts. It was 2 a.m., and our fingers found traffic, star-soaked under the green lights that glazed a numbness we reached for so desperately. Usually, our nights were wasted feeling too much, but that night we could at least touch nothingness. One night, I was out night driving with some friends, and the driver at the time was making jokes about falling asleep at the wheel. In a fun way, I yelled at them to go pull over. They ended up parking in a random parking lot, and we all just jumped out and started running. I don't even know if anyone instigated it. We just kinda went. There also hit a point where I started running slower than everyone else, just to absorb what was going on, to look at my friends and love them, despite some of their ideas almost getting us hit by cars. With my car seats fully reclined, the passenger seat waits for you as I fall asleep in mine. I hope you're still alive. I wrote this poem late at night, not knowing if one of my best friends had killed herself or not. Leading up to this moment, I got a phone call from her where she was crying and screaming and more distressed than I've ever heard her. She told me she was going to kill herself, and she allowed me to stay on the phone with her for a while, but at some point hung up. I panicked and drove straight to her house. I remember waiting at the bottom of her driveway because her house was up a hill, and phoning her over and over again. The reason this friend of mine came to this mindset was because of the abuse within her family. So I was hesitant to go directly up to the door because I was certain to have an altercation with her mother, on top of her mother even being aware of her wanting to commit suicide would have led to daily beatings afterwards. Thus, I called her a bunch of times, and amongst that wrote a couple poems, such as that one. This friend of mine did eventually answer after calming down a bit, and I got the appropriate people involved, and she is luckily still alive today. There were 4 bodies on each side of my body in the mosh pit. In the candy wrapper lights glazing every type of skin color, and this guy with this look in his eyes I've never seen before. I don't know if I should be scared or get closer, but then he came closer and kissed me. Music only makes people temporarily crazy, though, and he just disappeared. In 2017, I flew across the country to go to a Brockhampton concert. They had just come out with Saturation 2, so the crowd was extra excited for them to perform it. Obviously, concerts in general have extreme adrenaline type energy, but that one was on another level. I actually felt like my life changed that night, and near the end of it, the 2 friends I went with kind of drifted off to the back of the crowd, whereas I stayed up front in the mosh pit. I kind of just became buds with the people around me. We had our arms over each other and we were dancing and bouncing together, and at some point, this random ass dude just came up to me and kissed me. It was quick, but involved a face grab, and soon after he did the same thing to another woman, and then ran away. It was startling, but me and this other woman kind of bonded over it. Up until that moment, I didn't feel like I was the kind of person another person could pick out in a crowd. So in this weird kind of way, it meant something to me. The poem I have directly after that says, "You look like nothing's hurt you." And that is the best way I can describe the person that kissed me that night. Dancing in colors of Valentine's Day, she spins slower than the records. My floor and her body above are endless. There isn't a crazy deep meaning behind this one. I was literally on the bedroom floor of a close friend, falling in love with her. We're sexting and we're the same sex. She means more to me than my parents will ever believe. As the follow-up to that situation, I started exploring my sexuality around this time. You know, I've identified as pansexual since I've been about 14, but there was no one around me that I wanted to date, so I couldn't actually put that into practice. Up until my adult life, my mother struggled to acknowledge and accept my sexuality. I've talked about it before, but she did that classic move of, my religion doesn't agree with this, God will forgive you, this is just a phase. She told me I'm going to hell, all that fun stuff. So by saying, she means more to me than my parents will ever believe, came from her rejection and her refusal to believe the women I was with were anything but friends. She looks at me the same way I looked at myself when I, for the first time, got wasted with nobody else. Numbingly, melancholically. This poem addresses 2 things. I said, she looks at me the same way I looked at myself. The she I'm referencing is my best friend. I wrote about the exact moment before I made her cry. It's not my place to discuss what sort of conversation we had, but it was our first fight, essentially. I had opinions about a situation and expressed them in a mean way, and I made her cry. And I vividly remember the look on her face the moment before she did, which is what I wrote this poem about. The reference to alcohol, though, has the connection of the way she looked at me was the way I looked at myself when I first started drinking alone as a coping mechanism. And the very first time I did that, I remember looking in the mirror and just feeling so disappointed in myself, like I wanted to crumble. And just the way I looked at myself that night was so similar to how my best friend looked at me before I made her cry. I'm supposed to go back home, but I can't leave this place. Being away from everything that's made me who I am is the best feeling I've ever had. I can't leave, I can't leave, I can't leave, I can't leave. I wrote this while far away from my home. As I said, my household was quite toxic and induced my depression so often that I actually cried when I realized I had to go back to it. Those are all of the ones I'm going to share from youth, and so now we're moving on to Screaming Sweet Nothings. Sometimes our faces get too close for us to just be friends. Okay. I have had a bad habit of falling in love with my friends. Hear me out. There's a reason they're my friends, right? I care about them a lot. I identify with the things they identify with. We have the same morals. And there's just always been at least one point in every friendship where I've thought maybe we should date. Where the issues come in is that in the past, I've had trouble distinguishing what is flirting and romantic interest and what is people being nice to me. This all ties back to my childhood traumas mixed with toxic relationships I've been in, and like, we're all good now. You know, I've been through therapy and I got that shit figured out. But at the time I wrote this, I was overthinking everything to the minuscule detail of how close their face was to mine. Ugh. She lays on me softly, so gentle that everyone after her will be sandpaper. I know it. I wrote this about a very important person in my life. The first woman I started dating, and the first woman that broke my heart. There was not a single thing I didn't like about her. I'm genuinely, even the shitty parts of her, I adored. As we started getting more serious, I met her mom and her family, and she didn't meet mine. I wouldn't let her. Even though she wanted to, my mom still didn't believe that women were ever more than my friends. She still didn't agree with the gays, and I didn't want that to interrupt our relationship. Little did I know, it still would, and it still did. This woman told me she didn't want to be with someone who had a destructive family, because family is an important core value to her, and we separated. And that made me resent my mom so much more. Even when she wasn't involved with my life, she was involved with my life. The reason this person is so important to me, though, is because she's the reason my mom and I have healed that situation. There was a night where this ex's name came up in conversation, and when my mother asked me who that was, I just said, a girl I was seeing. She rolled her eyes, made faces, and in that moment I decided I was going to have a conversation with her that would most likely end our entire relationship. I played back everything from the moment I considered myself bisexual as an 11-12-year-old to the moment I figured out I was pansexual, and all of the shit she said to me amongst it all. To my surprise, she ended up crying and asking me to forgive her. That is not the direction I thought that was gonna go at all. I think my mom had a bit of a wake-up call, and our night ended with both of us crying and her letting me know that although she doesn't agree with my sexuality, she's going to do her best to understand it, and that if I bring home a woman in the future, she's gonna be okay with it. So the person I wrote this poem about shifted my entire relationship with my mother without even realizing it, by her just being in my life for a little period of time. My sex life could become better if I left my boyfriend for my vibrator. This one's a little self-explanatory. I was having a lot of bad sex around this time, and I know the topic can be a little taboo, but for me, it's important to be quite open and fluid with my sexuality and sex itself. I've been in a lot of partnerships, connections, relationships where my needs, wants, and desires have not been cared about, especially because I'm a woman. Like, currently I identify as a woman and non-binary. I use she, they pronouns. But in the past, traditionally, based off of the fact that I'm quite curvy and I have rather feminine features, I am over-sexualized and seen as something fuckable and not to be cared about. And that sounds harsh, but that's exactly how the men in my life made me feel. They didn't try to make me come. They didn't think communication and consent was sexy, although it really is. And in the end, they made me feel shameful for however my body did or didn't react to theirs. So, you know, fuck that. I have quite a few crude poems like that because I just got fed up with it all. I shouldn't feel lucky to have never been raped. I wrote this poem after coming home from a date where I had to scream at the guy to not fucking trap me in his house. After this one date I had where this guy and I went for about a 20-minute walk, and then he wanted to see a movie. The way he worded it implied it was going to be a movie theater, but it was his house. I was nervous and didn't have enough confidence to back out of the situation. Plus, at the time, he was the one driving us, so I was trying to see the best in him and in the situation, so the red flags ended up being shrugged away as possibly me overthinking or being a little anxious. No matter how many times I told him I didn't want to have sex, he tried to force it on me. When I started telling him I wanted to leave, he told me he was going to keep me there, and in the end I kind of went crazy, and he did drive me back to my house, and I cried there and thought to myself, wow, I'm so lucky I didn't get raped. And the saddest part about that is I shouldn't feel lucky. That's not lucky. The fact that that's a very common and real scenario for all women is actually disgusting. And so in this book of mine, that particular poem is the first of a heavy section on sexual assault.
Deja vu is the simplest way to describe me and you.
Do you remember that guy I talked about at the beginning of the video? He's back. This person is scattered throughout both of my books. Amongst different things happening in our life and other people coming and going, we were on and off for about 3 years. So he was a pretty important part in my life. Important? I don't know if that's the right word. He was there for a lot of it.
I don't ever want to leave your life. You do.
One of the things you'll notice throughout Screaming Sweet Nothings is that there's quotation marks over certain conversations. And I did that because anything with quotation marks was actually said to me. This reoccurring guy told me he doesn't ever want to leave my life. After doing that several times, I responded, "You do." And I was right. The poem I wrote directly after this quote is,
"Your silence has always given me a violent amount of longing, and you know that. And yet, here we are again."
So, you know.
He flirts with me, but still keeps her picture in his wallet.
There was this man who was 13 years older than me, who just bought $1 million house with his doctor girlfriend of 7 years. That would flirt with me at work, and around the time I started to question if I was interpreting it wrong, asked me for nudes and tried sexting me at 2 in the morning. It was an extremely shitty situation, mostly when it all imploded and backfired on him. After realizing I wasn't receiving this, he started making my life hell at work. In such a short period of time, it went from him complimenting the way I look to me entering a room and telling me I look fucking ugly today. I just took it for a very long time, the ways he insulted me or made my job in general difficult. But then eventually he started to slander my poetry book, and I couldn't stand for that. You know, my thought process was, he can hate the way I look. I'm not a model, I know that. He can add obstacles to my workplace environment. I will be able to navigate it, but what he can't do is tell people my poetry sucks when he hasn't even read it. That was the thing about it too. If he had actually read my book and had negative criticism based off of actual content, I would want to hear it. But I know for a fact he didn't. In the place that we worked, I was selling my books. I was selling my books at my job, and he would go to customers and tell them how bad it was and how much it sucked and how they shouldn't buy it. That for me wasn't just crossing the line, that was him hurdling himself over it. I confronted him about this situation and yelled at him in front of a bunch of people. That whole situation was just such a shit show, and the first poem I ever wrote about it was that one.
He is the same as getting pulled over by red and blue everything for the first time. Panic.
This is the last poem I ever wrote about him. He left our workplace, and I didn't need to see him for several months, maybe half a year, until one day he just came in to shop. And the moment I saw him, I had a panic attack. Thank God one of my closest coworkers was there because I was able to confide in him, but I didn't expect myself to react that way. I thought the situation was over, but trauma.
Choking is the only way a man has ever taken my breath away.
As you can gather, I was treated very shitty by many men throughout a couple years of my life. When I say that choking is the only way a man has taken away my breath, I'm referring to a couple different things. Both the commentary that I have not been impressed with the men around me, they're only taking from me and not adding value, but also that quite literally I've been choked by a man in not a sexy way. Essentially, I found a roommate who happened to be a man, and he started hitting me while we were living together. It didn't start off that way, but he always got high and drunk every night. And there was one point where we were watching a movie together, and he fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, and I needed to go to work the next day. It was maybe midnight, close to 1 o'clock, so I got up, and when I did, he slapped my face and told me to sit back down, and I didn't. I went to my room and then cried myself to sleep, and that happened a second time and a third time, and maybe 12 total. He would say things like, "I would never do this when I'm sober," although he was never sober. I started trying to move out, but I couldn't find any place I could afford. I'd also just got into a car accident, so I was trying to buy a car because there was no busing system to where I lived. I was literally trapped in that house. And you know, I've processed this all in therapy now, but there was a lot of details of that I didn't tell anyone about. Like the choking. He only did it once, but that is more than enough times. I told him I was gonna move out, and that was his reaction.
I'm much more interesting this year, and I will be every year afterwards, and I will always wish you met the newest version of me instead.
I feel this way about every single connection I've ever had in my life. From the old relationships in my life to that coworker and that roommate, all of the men that have abused me and the friends that have neglected me and neglected themselves and my mother. I always get these little moments where I think, if those situations happened now in my current life, they wouldn't get away with shit. I am so genuinely happy with who I am and proud of myself for getting through all of that shit. I wouldn't take it now. Those people knew the version of myself that was created from insecurities and trauma and self-hatred, but I'm so fucking cool now. I would never let that shit happen again. I would hold up the biggest fucking mirror and make them accountable. I realize how sad some of these poems were, so I want to reassure you that you don't need to feel sorry for me or feel the need to apologize on behalf of the people I've encountered. I pushed these experiences into poems in hopes that it would extend as some form of therapy to people who've gone through similar things. If you are one of those people, I'm so glad you're still here, and I understand how difficult it was to stay. For those who haven't but are listening and acknowledging my voice amongst these experiences, I love you. Genuinely though, people like you are necessary in this world. And with that said, I hope all of you are still around for when I publish my third poetry book. That is where I'm going to leave it today. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe, all that shit, and I will see you next Wednesday/Thursday. Have a great one.